A young homeless boy stood outside a luxurious cafe, watching as the city's elite dined without a care in the world. But in just a few moments, something was about to happen that no one could have expected. The entire cafe would fall silent, and all eyes would turn to him. What did he do? And why would this day change his life forever? Watch till the end to find out. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Malik pressed himself against the cold metal fence of the elite cafe, his stomach twisting with hunger. The scent of warm bread and roasted meat filled the air, making the ache in his gut even worse. He had been watching the cafe for a while now, waiting for a moment when an unattended plate might be left near the edge of a table, close enough for him to grab and disappear before anyone noticed. It had worked before. People in places like this barely looked at kids like him. He was just another shadow in the background, another piece of the city they chose to ignore. Inside, the cafe hummed with quiet luxury. Waiters moved gracefully between tables, their crisp uniforms spotless, balancing trays of carefully plated meals and steaming cups of coffee. The customers were dressed in expensive suits and elegant dresses, their laughter light, their conversations effortless. They belonged here. He did not. But then, something unusual caught his eye. At a prime table in the center of the patio sat Bernard Green. Even Malik, who barely paid attention to the world beyond survival, recognized the name. Bernard was a man of power, a real estate tycoon who had built an empire from nothing. He was wealthy, untouchable, and at 72 years old, he carried himself like someone who controlled not only his own world, but everyone else's too. His sharp suit, gold-rimmed glasses, and neatly combed silver hair made him look like the kind of man who never had to struggle a day in his life. Across from him sat Marissa, his much younger wife. She was beautiful in a way that felt almost artificial. Perfect makeup, sleek black hair that shone under the sunlight, a diamond bracelet that glittered whenever she moved. Everything about her screamed wealth, elegance, and control. But as she scrolled through her phone, disinterested in the man across from her, Malik noticed something cold in her expression. Bernard seemed distracted. His movements were slower than expected for a man of his stature. His fingers tapped absently against the polished wooden table as he scrolled through his phone. When he did look up at his wife, his gaze held something off. Fatigue, maybe? Or doubt? Malik couldn't tell. And then he saw it. Marissa's hand slipped into her designer handbag, her fingers moving with quiet precision. She pulled out a small glass vial no bigger than her thumb, twisting the cap with a slight flick of her wrist. The movement was so smooth, so practiced, that if Malik had blinked, he might have missed it. His breath caught in his throat. She tilted her hand ever so slightly over Bernard's steaming bowl of soup. A clear liquid dripped down into the broth, vanishing instantly as she gave a casual stir with the silver spoon beside it. Malik's heartbeat slammed against his ribs. For a second, he thought he was wrong. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just seasoning. But then he saw her lips move, barely a whisper as she leaned toward her husband. "After everything I've done, you won't ruin this now." A chill raced down Malik's spine. He knew what he had just seen. She poisoned his food. His fingers curled into fists, nails digging into his palms. He wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't his problem. Who would believe him? A street kid? An invisible nobody? But then Bernard picked up the spoon. Malik froze. His mind screamed at him to move, to look away, to forget this. But his body refused. He saw Bernard dip the spoon into the soup, lifting it slowly toward his mouth. Time stretched. The world blurred, the sounds of the cafe fading into white noise. Malik shoved off the railing and took a step forward, his heart hammering. Bernard's spoon was inches from his lips. "Don't eat that!" His voice cut through the air like a knife. Every conversation stopped. A woman gasped. A fork clattered against a plate. The entire cafe turned toward him, eyes wide with shock. Bernard froze, the spoon hovering midair. His gaze snapped to the boy standing at the patio fence. Marissa's head whipped around, her face hardening. "What did you just say?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to slice through glass. Malik's chest heaved, but he didn't back down. He had seen it. He knew the truth. "She put something in your food," he said, his voice shaky but loud enough for everyone to hear. "I saw her. Don't eat it." The reaction was instant. A wave of whispers rippled through the cafe. Heads turned, eyes darted between Bernard, Marissa, and the ragged boy who had just shattered the perfect, polished atmosphere. Bernard's eyes narrowed as he looked at his wife. "Marissa?" Her expression shifted in an instant. The perfect poise, the elegant charm, it all snapped. She shot to her feet so fast that her chair scraped loudly against the stone floor. "You little liar," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "How dare you accuse me of something so vile? Who even let you in here?" Malik's hands trembled at his sides, but he stood his ground. "I'm not lying," he said, his voice stronger this time. "I saw you. You poured something into his soup when he wasn't looking." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Bernard's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened around the spoon. His knuckles turned white as he slowly set it back into the bowl. His voice was calm, but there was something dangerous beneath it. "What is he talking about, Marissa?" She laughed, but it was brittle, forced. "He's a street rat," she spat, "probably looking for money. Bernard, don't entertain this nonsense." The crowd's murmurs grew louder. Malik could feel the weight of every single pair of eyes pressing down on him, but he refused to look away. "Smell it," he said, his voice steady. "If you don't believe me, just smell it." Bernard hesitated. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. He turned his gaze back to his wife. "Marissa," he said again, his voice lower this time. "What is going on?" Her mask cracked. For the first time, she looked afraid. Malik's chest was heaving, his hands still trembling, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. The cafe remained frozen in silence, the weight of Malik's accusation hanging in the air like a thick storm cloud. Eyes darted between him, Bernard, and Marissa, the tension so heavy it felt like the entire world had stopped breathing. Bernard hadn't moved, his hand still gripping the spoon, his gaze locked onto his wife. Marissa, however, was the first to react. She straightened, her perfectly polished demeanor barely holding together as she let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "You're actually listening to him?" she scoffed, turning toward Bernard, her expression shifting into one of mock disbelief. "This is ridiculous. Bernard, do you hear yourself? He's just some street kid trying to cause trouble." Bernard's fingers curled around the spoon, but he didn't take a bite. Instead, he studied her with a scrutinizing gaze, his sharp mind turning over the pieces of the puzzle. Something about the way she reacted wasn't right. Marissa was always in control, always composed, yet there was a nervous edge to her now, a flicker of something that made his stomach tighten. He glanced at the bowl of soup in front of him, his appetite gone. "Malik, standing just beyond the fence, felt his heart pounding against his ribs. He had done it. He had spoken up, but now he was trapped under the weight of everyone's attention. His hands were shaking, but he clenched them into fists, forcing himself to stay firm. He had seen what he had seen. He couldn't back down now. "I'm not lying," he said, his voice steadier now. "I saw her put something in your soup. I swear." A murmur ran through the cafe, whispers spreading like wildfire. People exchanged glances, shifting in their seats. Some looked skeptical, others intrigued. The tension was growing, thickening with each passing second. Bernard let out a slow breath, his gaze never leaving his wife. "Marissa," he said, his voice calm but firm. "He's either telling the truth or he's a very good liar. Either way, there's a simple way to prove it." Marissa's shoulders stiffened. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice too smooth, too controlled. Bernard slid the bowl of soup slightly toward her. "Take a bite." A hush fell over the cafe. Marissa's expression didn't falter immediately, but there was the briefest flicker of hesitation in her eyes, a split second where her mind calculated the best response. She scoffed, shaking her head. "I'm not playing this game, Bernard. This is beneath both of us." Bernard didn't move. "If you have nothing to hide, take a bite." Her jaw tightened. She was trapped, and she knew it. If she refused, the doubt in Bernard's mind would solidify. If she ate the soup, she would be risking her own life. She let out a breathless laugh, reaching for her handbag as if the entire conversation wasn't worth her time. "I don't have to prove anything to some filthy street kid," she snapped, her voice sharp, dismissive. She turned to Malik, her dark eyes burning into him. "You don't belong here. This isn't your world. You think you can just waltz in and make accusations? You're nothing." Malik flinched, but he refused to back down. "Then prove it," he shot back. "Eat the soup." The tension was unbearable now, thick enough to choke on. A waiter, who had been frozen in place, finally took a cautious step forward. "Sir," he said, addressing Bernard carefully, Should I call someone?" Bernard didn't answer right away. He was still watching Marissa, his mind working rapidly. He had spent decades making deals, reading people, knowing when someone was bluffing. And right now, he could see the cracks forming in her carefully constructed mask. Marissa suddenly let out a harsh laugh. "You're really going to do this?" she asked, shaking her head. "Over what? The word of a boy who probably hasn't had a proper meal in weeks?" She gestured toward Malik with a dismissive wave of her hand. "This is absurd. He's lying." Bernard finally set the spoon down, exhaling slowly. "Maybe he is," he said evenly. "But you're acting like someone with something to hide." Marissa's nostrils flared. "I can't believe you're entertaining this." She shot a glare at the waiter, then at the growing crowd of people watching them. "This is exactly what he wants. Attention, money, pity, and you're giving it to him." Malik felt a cold wave of doubt wash over him. What if she was right? What if Bernard chose to believe her? What if he had just made a mistake that would cost him more than he could afford? Bernard leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple as if considering the weight of the situation. Then, without another word, he picked up the soup bowl and lifted it toward his nose, inhaling deeply. The moment stretched, and then he placed it back down, his expression unreadable. "Call the police," he said. The words hit like a thunderclap. Marissa's head snapped up, her entire body stiffening. "Bernard, no." Bernard didn't look at her. He turned to the waiter. "Do it, now." The waiter hesitated, then quickly turned and hurried inside. The murmurs in the cafe grew louder. People were shifting, watching, whispering. Phones were coming out. Some had already started recording. Marissa's carefully built composure was beginning to crumble. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "You can't be serious," she hissed. Bernard finally met her gaze. "You've been acting strange for weeks," he said quietly. "I should have noticed sooner." Marissa's chest rose and fell in rapid breaths. "You're making a mistake." "Then sit down," Bernard said, "and wait for them to test the soup." Her eyes darkened, her breath sharp as she exhaled. "You bastard," she whispered under her breath, her voice so low only he could hear. Bernard didn't flinch. He just sat there, watching as she reached for her handbag, her knuckles white with tension. Malik barely dared to breathe. His hands were still shaking, his pulse thundering in his ears. He had done everything he could. Now it was up to Bernard. The cafe was no longer a place of casual luxury. It had become a stage for something far darker, and no one was looking away. This wasn't over, not yet. Malik stood stiffly by the patio fence, his body tense as he watched the scene unfold. His heart was still hammering in his chest, but he had no intention of running. He had done what he could. Now it was out of his hands. Inside the cafe, the weight of Bernard's words still hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Marissa hadn't moved from her spot, but every inch of her body screamed resistance. Her perfectly polished nails dug into the edge of the table, her grip tightening on her handbag as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered. Her breathing had become uneven, her chest rising and falling more rapidly than before. But she wasn't giving in. Not yet. She forced out a short, sharp laugh, tilting her head as she addressed Bernard, her voice laced with controlled frustration. "You're being ridiculous. You're really going to waste everyone's time over this? Over a little street rat making wild accusations?" Bernard's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady, controlled. "If it's all nonsense, then you have nothing to worry about." His gaze was sharp as a blade, watching every movement she made, every flicker of emotion that crossed her face. Marissa let out an exasperated sigh, shaking her head as she glanced around the cafe as if seeking an ally among the staring patrons. But all she found were wide eyes and whispered conversations. The weight of their judgment pressed down on her. No one was coming to her defense. She turned her attention back to Malik, her expression darkening. "I don't know what your game is," she said, her voice low and threatening, "but you're making a very big mistake." Malik clenched his fists at his sides, refusing to back down. His throat was dry, but he forced himself to swallow. "I'm not playing a game," he said. "I saw you put something in his soup." Bernard watched the exchange in silence, his mind working quickly. He had spent years reading people, knowing when someone was lying, when they were bluffing. Right now, his wife was trapped, and she knew it. Every excuse she threw out sounded weaker than the last. The cafe doors swung open as a waiter hurried back outside, his face pale. "The police are on their way," he announced. A fresh ripple of murmurs moved through the cafe. Phones were out now, cameras pointed toward the table, capturing every second. Marissa's expression flickered for just a moment. Fear. It was brief, barely there, but Bernard caught it. It was the first honest emotion she had shown since the accusation had been made. She took a deep breath, smoothing her expression back into one of carefully placed indignation. "This is humiliating," she muttered, shaking her head. "You're making a fool of yourself, Bernard. Do you realize how this looks?" Bernard didn't respond. Instead, he reached for the bowl of soup again, carefully lifting it toward his nose. The steam carried a faint scent of spices and herbs, but something was off. Something subtle, barely noticeable. But it was there. His grip tightened around the edge of the bowl. "I should have seen this coming," he said quietly. Marissa stilled. "What?" Bernard set the bowl down gently, his movements deliberate. He didn't look at her right away, just exhaled slowly before meeting her gaze. "You've been acting different for weeks. Distant, short-tempered, and now this?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, something dark and unreadable. "Tell me the truth, Marissa." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The tension in her shoulders grew more pronounced. "I don't have to justify myself to you," she snapped. "You're really willing to throw away everything because some filthy kid said a few words?" Bernard didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward Malik. "You said you saw her put something in the soup," he said. "Describe it to me." Malik straightened, grateful for the chance to prove he wasn't lying. "It was a small bottle," he said quickly. "Clear liquid. She opened it fast, like she'd done it before. Just tipped it in, then stirred it with the spoon like nothing happened." Bernard studied him for a long moment. There was no hesitation in the boy's eyes, no flicker of uncertainty. Marissa scoffed. "And you believe him? Bernard, he's a liar. Look at him. He's desperate for attention, for money." "If he wanted money," Bernard said evenly, "he would have asked for it." Marissa opened her mouth to argue, but the sound of distant sirens cut through the air. They were close now. For the first time, true panic flickered across her features. She turned to Bernard, leaning forward, lowering her voice. "Don't do this," she murmured. "Think about what this will mean for us. For you. You really want to make a scene like this? You want the media to get hold of it?" Bernard's expression remained unreadable. "I want the truth." Her lips pressed into a thin line. Her fingers curled tighter around her handbag, her knuckles going white. "I can't believe you're doing this," she whispered. The police cars pulled up just beyond the cafe's entrance. The blue and red lights flashed against the glass windows, casting eerie reflections across the tables and silverware. Two uniformed officers stepped out, scanning the patio before striding toward Bernard's table. One of them, a tall man with a stern expression, approached Bernard directly. "We received a report about a possible poisoning attempt," he said, glancing between the seated couple and Malik. "Can someone explain what's going on here?" Bernard gestured toward the bowl in front of him. "This boy claims my wife put something in my soup," he said plainly. "He says he saw her do it." The officer frowned, shifting his gaze to Marissa. "Ma'am, do you have anything to say about this?" Marissa's face hardened. "This is ridiculous," she said. "My husband is being manipulated by some street urchin who wants attention. There's nothing wrong with that soup. This whole thing is a joke." The officer didn't react to her tone. He turned back to Bernard. "Would you like us to test it?" Marissa's hands clenched so tightly around her bag that her nails dug into the leather. Bernard didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. The officer nodded and reached down for the bowl. "No." The word left Marissa's lips before she could stop it. It was quiet, barely audible over the whispers surrounding them, but it was enough. Enough to make Bernard's gaze snap toward her. Enough to make the officers pause. For the first time, she looked cornered, and Malik knew she had just made her biggest mistake yet. The single word, "no," hung in the air like a gunshot. The cafe had already been silent, but now it felt as if the entire world had paused, every pair of eyes locked onto Marissa. Bernard's expression darkened, his grip tightening around the edge of the table. Malik, standing just beyond the patio fence, barely breathed. He knew this was the moment everything would unravel. Marissa must have realized it too, because in the next second she tried to recover. She forced out a short, brittle laugh, shaking her head. "I mean, this is absurd," she said quickly. "You really think I would poison my own husband? That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard." She turned to Bernard, her gaze pleading now. "Darling, you know me. You know I would never—" Bernard raised a hand, silencing her. His voice was low, controlled. "Then let them test it." Marissa's jaw clenched. Her fingers curled into tight fists on the table, her knuckles white. The police officer who had reached for the bowl hesitated, his sharp gaze flicking between the two of them. "Ma'am," he said, his tone calm but firm, "if there's nothing to hide, there's no reason to object." Marissa's chest rose and fell with sharp, uneven breaths. Her entire body was tense, wound tight like a coil ready to snap. She swallowed hard, and for the first time since this entire confrontation had started, she looked afraid. Bernard saw it. Malik saw it. And so did everyone else watching. The whispers in the cafe grew louder. Phones were still raised, cameras recording every detail. The entire world was witnessing her unravel in real time. Malik took a step forward, his voice steadier than before. "She knows what's in that soup." Marissa's head snapped toward him, her eyes blazing with pure venom. "Shut up," she hissed, her voice low, dangerous. "You have no idea what you're talking about." The officer didn't like that. He straightened, shifting his stance slightly. "Ma'am, please stay seated," he said firmly, "and I'd advise you to cooperate." Bernard leaned back slightly in his chair, watching her carefully. His face remained unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. Marissa was cornered. She knew it. And then she did the only thing she had left. She snapped. With a sudden, violent motion, she shoved back her chair, the metal legs scraping against the stone patio floor. "This is insane!" she yelled, her voice rising now, raw with frustration and desperation. "I don't have to sit here and take this. This is humiliating." One of the officers immediately stepped forward, but Bernard held up a hand. He wanted to see what she would do next. Marissa's gaze darted around wildly, searching for an escape, a way out. But there wasn't one. The police were here. The crowd was watching. And Bernard, her husband, wasn't coming to her defense. Her breathing was sharp and erratic now, and when she finally turned back to Bernard, something in her expression had shifted. The mask was gone. The carefully crafted charm, the elegance, the practiced warmth. It had all shattered. What remained was something cold, something bitter. "You were supposed to die," she whispered. The words were quiet, but the impact was like a lightning strike. A collective gasp rippled through the cafe. The officers stiffened, exchanging glances. Bernard didn't move. Malik felt his entire body go cold. Bernard's voice, when he finally spoke, was eerily calm. "What did you just say?" Marissa let out a breathless laugh, her hands trembling now. "You think I wanted to waste my life taking care of some old man?" she spat, her voice dripping with resentment. "I was supposed to inherit everything, Bernard, everything. But you just kept living, kept dragging it out. Do you have any idea how exhausting that was?" Silence. Absolute silence. Bernard's expression didn't change, but his fingers tapped once against the table, slow and deliberate. "So, you poisoned my soup," he said. It wasn't a question. Marissa's lips pressed into a thin, taut line. She knew there was no way out now. The confession had already left her mouth. The damage was done. But she still lifted her chin, defiant even in her downfall. "You were never supposed to see another sunrise." A sharp voice cut through the thick tension. "That's enough," one of the officers said, stepping forward. "Marissa Green, you're under arrest for attempted murder." The moment the words left his mouth, Marissa moved. She bolted. It was a mistake. The second she lunged, the officers reacted. One grabbed her by the arm, yanking her back before she could get even 2 steps away. She shrieked, thrashing violently, but another officer was already securing her wrists, snapping handcuffs around them. "No!" she screamed, struggling. "You don't understand. This isn't fair. I deserve—" Her words were cut off as they forced her arms behind her back, keeping her restrained. She fought them every step of the way, but it was useless. The fight was over. Bernard remained perfectly still as he watched his wife being dragged away. His face was unreadable, but his grip on the table had loosened. His shoulders, usually squared and commanding, sagged slightly. He looked tired. Malik, still standing by the fence, couldn't tear his eyes away. He had just watched a woman confess to attempted murder, had just seen her true nature unravel in front of everyone. And now she was being taken away, screaming and fighting, while Bernard sat frozen in his chair. Marissa's screams faded as the officers pulled her toward the waiting police car. "You'll regret this, Bernard. You'll regret this," she shrieked. "I deserved it. I deserved everything." And then she was gone. Silence settled over the cafe once again. The tension that had held the entire room in its grip was beginning to release, but no one knew what to say. No one knew how to react. Bernard exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. He finally looked up, his gaze settling on Malik. For the first time since this began, there was something different in his eyes. Not shock, not disbelief. Something closer to gratitude. Something closer to understanding. The cafe remained in stunned silence long after the police car disappeared down the street. People sat frozen in their seats, whispers buzzing around the patio like trapped insects. Some had their phones still raised, recording the aftermath of what had just happened. Others were staring at Bernard, at the empty chair across from him, at the untouched bowl of soup that now carried the weight of attempted murder. The energy in the air had changed. No longer a place of quiet luxury, the cafe had become the setting of a crime scene. Bernard hadn't moved. His shoulders, once squared with the confidence of a man who controlled his world, now sagged slightly, his posture heavy. His fingers traced absent patterns against the wooden table, as if grounding himself in the reality of what had just unfolded. His wife, his much younger, beautiful, elegant wife, had just tried to kill him, had just been dragged away in handcuffs, screaming that she deserved everything he had. The words still echoed in his mind, ringing in his ears like a ghost that refused to leave. Malik stood nearby, just outside the patio fence. His pulse had started to slow, but the adrenaline was still fresh in his system, leaving his body tense, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. He wasn't sure if he should leave. He had done what he came to do. He had stopped a murder. But now, as he stood there watching Bernard, he felt something unexpected. Pity. Bernard Green was a man who had everything. Wealth, power, influence, and yet, right now, he looked completely alone. A waiter hesitantly approached the table, his voice cautious, as if afraid of breaking whatever trance Bernard was in. "Sir, do you need anything?" Bernard blinked once, then slowly turned his head. "No," he said after a moment, his voice quieter than before. "No, I'm fine." He wasn't. The waiter lingered for a second, as if debating whether or not to say more, then simply nodded and stepped away, giving Bernard space. The cafe had started to come back to life, patrons whispering among themselves, some discreetly leaving, others staying to absorb the scandal of it all, but Bernard remained in place, unmoving. And then, finally, he lifted his gaze and met Malik's eyes. The boy tensed automatically, unsure of what was about to happen. Would Bernard be angry? Would he blame him for ruining his life, for exposing his wife? Malik had no idea what a rich man like this might do, but when Bernard spoke, his voice carried something that Malik didn't expect. "You saved my life." Malik hesitated. He hadn't expected gratitude. He hadn't expected anything, really. I couldn't let it happen," he said, his voice quieter than before. Bernard studied him for a long moment, his gaze sharp but not unkind. There was a calculating look in his eyes, but not the kind that spoke of business deals or power plays. No, this was something different. This was a man who had just had his world upended and was now seeing things with fresh eyes. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit." Malik hesitated again, glancing around as if expecting someone to step in and tell him he didn't belong. But no one did. Slowly, cautiously, he moved forward, stepping inside the cafe for the first time. He slid into the chair, his body stiff, unsure of why he was even doing this. But there was something about Bernard's tone, something in the way he looked at him, that made it impossible to walk away. Bernard leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. "What's your name?" "Malik," the boy answered. Bernard nodded, as if committing it to memory. Then, after a brief pause, he asked something Malik hadn't expected. "How long have you been on the street?" Malik's first instinct was to lie, to brush off the question, to make it seem like he was fine, like this wasn't his reality. But then he realized there was no point. Bernard wasn't asking out of pity. He wasn't looking at him like the other cafe patrons had, with judgment, with a mix of disdain and discomfort. Bernard was looking at him like someone who actually wanted to know. "A while," Malik finally admitted, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. "Couple years." Bernard exhaled through his nose, nodding slowly. He didn't press for details. He didn't ask the kind of questions that most people did. "Where's your family? How did you end up like this? What happened?" No, Bernard simply absorbed the information, filing it away as if it was all he needed to know. Then, without breaking eye contact, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black phone. He pressed a button, bringing it to his ear. "Yes," he said after a beat, his voice calm but firm. "It's Bernard. I need a favor." Malik frowned slightly, shifting in his seat. He wasn't sure what was happening. Bernard continued, his voice steady, authoritative. "There's a boy here. His name is Malik. I want you to find a place for him to stay tonight. Somewhere safe. I don't care how you do it, just make it happen." Malik stiffened. His instinct kicked in, that familiar feeling of distrust rising in his chest. People didn't do things for free. There was always a catch, always a price. "I don't need charity," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. Bernard lowered the phone slightly, his gaze unwavering. "This isn't charity." Malik narrowed his eyes. "Then what is it?" Bernard set the phone down for a moment, lacing his fingers together on the table. "You did something today that most people wouldn't have done," he said. "You saw something wrong, and you spoke up. You didn't have to. You could have walked away, but you didn't." Malik didn't respond. Bernard tilted his head slightly. "You changed my life today, Malik." He gestured toward himself. "Maybe I can change yours." The words sat heavy in the air between them. Malik didn't know how to respond. He had spent so long surviving, so long expecting nothing, that the idea of someone genuinely offering help without expecting something in return felt foreign. But Bernard wasn't pushing him. He wasn't pressuring him. He was simply laying the choice in front of him. Malik swallowed hard, his fingers tightening on the table. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something unfamiliar. Hope. The cafe had begun to return to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after what had just unfolded. Waiters cautiously resumed their duties, carrying trays of food to customers who were no longer fully focused on their meals. Conversations started up again, though most were still centered around what they had just witnessed. But at Bernard's table, everything remained still. Malik sat rigid in his chair, his mind racing as he processed what was happening. A part of him still expected Bernard to change his mind, to suddenly withdraw his offer and send him on his way. People didn't help kids like him, not unless they wanted something. He had learned that the hard way. Bernard, however, remained calm, his posture relaxed yet purposeful. He lifted his phone again, speaking into it in a tone that brokered no argument. "Yes, I'll be staying here for a little while longer. Have someone meet me at my office in an hour. Make sure they know the boy's name. Malik." He paused. "And make sure he's taken care of." He ended the call and set the phone down, looking across the table at Malik with an unreadable expression. Malik's fingers curled around the edge of his chair. "Why are you doing this?" His voice wasn't accusatory, but there was a layer of suspicion beneath it, something he couldn't quite suppress. Bernard considered him for a long moment before speaking. "Because you didn't have to do what you did today," he said simply. "Most people wouldn't have." Malik frowned. "I wasn't trying to get anything out of it." Bernard nodded as if he had already known that. "That's exactly why I want to help." Malik's instincts screamed at him to reject the offer, to shake his head, to get up and walk away, to return to the streets where he knew the rules, where he wasn't relying on anyone but himself. But then he thought about the last few nights he had spent outside, about the cold concrete beneath him, about the nights he had gone to sleep with an empty stomach. And he thought about what would have happened if he hadn't spoken up today, if Bernard had eaten that soup, if no one had ever known the truth. He let out a slow breath. "What does that even mean?" Bernard leaned back slightly, watching him carefully. "It means I don't think you should be sleeping on the streets anymore." His tone was casual, but there was something firm beneath it, something that told Malik this wasn't a passing offer. "It means I can do something about that." Malik swallowed hard. He didn't know how to trust something like this. Every time someone had promised to help him before, it had come with strings attached. But Bernard wasn't offering handouts. He wasn't offering pity. He was offering something else entirely. A chance. Bernard studied him for a moment longer before nodding slightly, as if he had come to a decision. He pushed back his chair, standing up. "Come with me." Malik hesitated. His first instinct was to stay put, to keep himself at a safe distance. But something in Bernard's tone told him that this was real, that this wasn't a trick or a trap, that maybe, just maybe, this was the break he had been waiting for. Slowly, cautiously, he stood. Bernard didn't say anything as he started toward the exit of the cafe. Malik followed, still wary, still unsure, but taking each step with purpose. As they walked past the other tables, he could feel the lingering stares of the other patrons. A few of them whispered to one another, their curiosity obvious, but none of them said anything. None of them tried to stop him. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the pavement as they stepped outside. Bernard adjusted his cufflinks, glancing down the street. A black car was already waiting at the curb. He turned to Malik, his expression serious but not unkind. "You don't have to decide right now," he said, "but if you get in that car, things change." Malik's chest tightened. He had never been given a choice like this before. His whole life had been dictated by circumstances beyond his control, but now, standing here, he had one. He took a deep breath, and then he stepped forward. Bernard nodded once, opening the door for him. And just like that, everything changed. In the end, one brave choice changed everything. Malik risked everything to save a stranger, and in return, his own life took a new path. What would you have done in his place? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends.